right, it's 5:30. We're going to start. This is the Committee of the Whole meeting of the City of Merrill. We're in City Hall Council Chambers. It is Tuesday, May 14th, 2024 at 5:30. Next item on the agenda is roll call.
Mr. Andrew Kaler.
Here.
Mr. Michael Kaler.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Ms. Firmanek.
Here.
Mr. Lass.
Here.
Mr. Rick.
Here.
Mr. Wykes. No. Ms. Rakowski.
Here.
Mayor Haas.
Here.
We have 8 out of 9.
Thank you. Next, we have public comment. Public comment. Anybody on the phone? Hearing none, we'll move on to placing the minutes from the previous meeting on file, April 9th, 2024 meeting minutes. I'll make a motion to place those minutes on file.
I'll second that motion.
I have a motion and a second to place the minutes of the April 9th, 2024 meeting on file. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next is general agenda items for consideration. We have presentation by Ellers Public Financial Advisors and consideration of the 2024 borrowing process. A, 2023-2024 city and tax increment district borrowing, and B, refinancing of 2022 note anticipation note.
Great.
Emily, do you want to start out? Or?
Sure. I just wanted to introduce Brian Riley for anyone who doesn't know. He's
Yep.
from Ellers.
Yeah, Brian's here. Okay.
Brian, you've been with the city for several years.
Myself, I've been with the firm for 20 years. We've worked with Merrill almost that entire time, if not longer, so predates myself. So.
Yeah. Great. Great. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the borrowing for 2024, and what we're looking at doing is borrowing for our 2023 projects. As some of you remember, we did not borrow last year, so we're going to borrow now for those projects, sort of reimbursement of the general fund for those projects. We're looking to borrow for 2024 projects. These were the projects that were approved in the budget that was adopted in 2024. And then we also have a refinancing piece. This is a 2022 NAN that we took out that needs to be refinanced. So I'll turn things over to Brian to walk through the presentation.
All right, thank you. Apologize, I've got a delivery at the house that I didn't know was coming today, and my daughter's the only one there, so I'm ignoring it at this point. So, wanted to walk through a number of things, primarily looking backwards a little bit to the 2023 budget. There are a number of capital items that the city will be looking to reimburse prior expenditures. So just to reiterate, those are last year's capital expenditures. They've essentially been carried through the use of cash, and the city has documented its intent to subsequently issue debt to reimburse, essentially enter into financing after the fact. And that is done quite frequently. It's not uncommon to see. There are some efficiencies in combining years as well. And so also then going to take a look at the 2024 capital budget, which was adopted in 2023. And again, that's looking at funding projects that are in the budget. And this is really a high-level overview. We're not here today to discuss the intricate detail of the finance plan. It's really to give you a baseline profile. Where do you stand presently? We'll walk through the tax increment districts in some measure, and I'm happy to get into whatever detail you'd like. So I'll try to keep it high level and get you oriented around the financial profile of the tax increment districts, and then talk through some general thoughts and ideas on the capital financing program, both 23 and 24 capital projects. And there was some reference to some interim financing that was done in 2022 to essentially fund capital items, but then look to the permanent financing at another time. And we're approaching that moment in time, all right? And all throughout, and certainly defer to Your Honor the Mayor in terms of the communication here, but I'm happy to answer questions along the way, provided that the Mayor's comfortable with having some interjection as we move along.
Absolutely.
All right. First page of the handout deals with what I would generically call your borrowing capacity. And just to preface, the state has imposed limitations on all local units of government with respect to the amount of general obligation debt that you can have outstanding at any time. General obligation debt is the best credit the city can offer when undertaking financing. It is a pledge of your full faith and credit. That means you will pay it from any available source, and it is secured by your unlimited taxing authority. You can levy an amount that is unlimited in terms of dollar or tax rate. And so essentially that is a very strong pledge on the part of the city, because every year, and it's an irrevocable pledge, right? So when one council issues the debt, authorizes it, and it's put into place, no future council can revoke the levy associated with those individual debt issues. So it's an irrevocable pledge. So again, a very strong credit on the part of the city. As such, the state limits how much you can borrow in that regard. There are other ways you can borrow through pledges of, say, other revenues or an appropriation, et cetera, but those are lesser credits. They typically come at slightly higher cost. They're not necessarily limited in terms of the dollar amount. So in the case of the general obligation debt, you're limited to 5% of the city's total equalized value. And so your current equalized value is just under $655 million. That's on the far left side of this table. The current borrowing capacity of the city in that context then is $32,745,000, we'll call it. So that's the maximum amount of general obligation debt you have access to. You'll likely never issue that much, but it's a benchmark that is cast in stone essentially by the state, and it changes with your valuation. As the valuation goes up or down, the 5% obviously changes as a result of that. And so what we have set out here in the middle of the table is all of the general obligation debt you have outstanding and the principal amounts that come due each and every year over the remaining lives of those respective issues. All right, and you can see the remaining total amounts at the bottom. And so when you take into consideration what you have outstanding and what you have essentially established as a budget and a levy for debt service this year, we can roll forward to the end of the year because you'll collect all those taxes. If there's debt payable from other funds, those transfers are made. And other funds, I mean TID funds, water utility, sewer utility, et cetera. Those transfers are made throughout the year. And so we can go to the end of the year. And as of right now, your available borrowing capacity is a little over $16.5 million. That's about half of what you have available under statute. If we go forward in time and look at some benchmarks or thresholds as we look, say, out about 10 years, if you do nothing else in terms of additional financing, in 3 years you'll be back to about 65%, and in a little more than 5 years you're at about 75%. I'll just pause quickly and see if there are any questions.
For other municipalities our size, are we in a favorable at 50%, say?
I'd say you're about average. I did go back. We have this similar conversation every time the city's engaging in some capital financing discussions. And if I go back a number of years, this is probably the best position you've been in at this moment in time before we go into the borrowing aspect from available capacity going back about 3 to 4 years.
Okay, thank you.
All right. From that point, then, we've kind of set the stage on where are you at from a capacity perspective. Because any point you want to borrow and use your general obligation debt, that's certainly the first place I look. Just statutorily, where do you stand? Because there is a hard and fast limitation, and we need to satisfy that. You're in good shape. As far as what's your cost of carrying that debt? And so the metric we would typically look at is how much are you levying in taxes to pay debt service. And I had already made the reference to when you issue general obligation debt, it may be for a number of different purposes. You may be doing it for utility projects. In that case, the water or the sewer utility are typically paying the freight. They're paying the principal and interest requirements on an annual basis on that debt. It doesn't mean you get to back that out from the limitation calculation. It just means that you're not levying generally applicable property taxes to pay the debt service. The utilities, the enterprise funds are picking up. It's the same concept with TIF districts, although in some cases you do borrow before you have all of the revenues kind of in hand or in place to pay the debt service. We'll look at a few of those examples here in a moment. But in any event, once you net out all of the revenues that are there to pay debt service away from the tax levy, then we arrive at how much are you levying in taxes on an annual basis just to make debt payments. And so what this chart shows you is with all the debt you have presently outstanding and what's payable from the levy, what does that look like over a long-term basis? And when we look at the tax rate, we hold the value constant. Just like in the last table, we've got your current value. We're not building in any type of either inflationary increase or new value to the number. So in this case, for 2024, you're just under 1.8 million in terms of what the city levies for debt service. So out of your total levy, in dollar terms, 1.8 million of that, roughly a little less than that, is directed specifically to pay principal and interest on your outstanding debt. A more approachable metric is the tax rate for debt service. So when we look at tax rates, we look at them versus equalized value. You would most specifically be looking at likely assessed values. We don't tend to use assessed value because it is subject to volatility. And you just went through, I think, a period of doing a reval here not that long ago. And so you really didn't create any economic value. You just brought balance back to the assessment equation in terms of maybe older properties and newer properties being assessed at different times, right? The newer construction typically assesses out very close to market value, whereas maybe some older properties don't. So you kind of reset the deck chairs on the assessed aspect, but you've really created no economic value. Equalized value is more consistent over time. For any number of reasons. And so that 1.79 million that you're levying for debt service equates to, from a tax rate perspective, to $3.75 per thousand of equalized value. So when you're looking at the chart, the blue bars are the columns are the dollar amounts of levy. The red line is the tax rate for debt service. And because we hold the value constant, when the amount you're levying for debt service declines, obviously the tax rate associated with that declines as well. So you can see there's a number of step downs in the dollar amount of debt service, which then equates to a decrease in the tax rate. But ultimately, that's debt falling off. So if we go back to the past page, which I'm not going to look at, but you can see where debt matures and the debt service associated with prior issues goes away. And so then this also gives us opportunities to backfill to some degree. And as you have new debt, we can look at these spots in the structure and bring in new debt service without necessarily causing a corresponding and material increase to the tax rate. All right, and so we use these moments to then look at where can we fill in for some additional debt service and minimize the tax impact. Any questions on this information that I could field?
But if we continue to borrow, we're not really gaining. Is that?
It depends. We have latitude with structuring debt, which we've taken advantage of in some circumstances. Unlike, say, a consumer loan, where you go get a home loan or a car loan, if you go to the bank and get financing, you don't walk in there and say, I'd really like to pay interest only for 2 years, and then I'll pay amortizing payments for whatever, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 20 years in the case of a home loan. You have to do a series of transactions to get there. When we issue long-term financing for the city, we have latitude to be flexible in terms of how we structure the debt. So in this case, if we just did level payments for every single issue, they would start to stack. And you'd see the blue bars would be getting higher in dollar amount, and then they'd fall off precipitously. But we have the latitude to be able to structure things. So when you take on new money, you get to make decisions in terms of how you'd like to see things. There's only so far we can go in some cases, but there are occasions where for the first couple years, we might do interest-only payments to mitigate the upfront tax impact, and then the principal and interest picks up at some point in the future. We don't always have to do that, and we're always happy to show you multiple options so that you can be informed and weigh in and make those sorts of decisions. And we'll also show you the cost of making those decisions. Obviously, if you defer principal, you will pay more in interest over time. And so there's no free lunch when trying to find ways to mitigate some of the upfront impact. When we look at some of the other like the utilities, they're revenue-producing entities, and sometimes you're kind of boxed in and you don't have a whole lot of choice in that regard. Same thing with TIF district. There's only so much revenue available, and so oftentimes you have to get creative with how you structure the debt in order to exercise some measure of risk mitigation, but to make the revenues and the expenses match. In the case of debt service, general obligation debt service that you levy for, you can levy an unlimited amount, so you're not constrained. So then you get to make decisions, and it's how much of a tax impact are we willing to accept, both in terms of dollar amount and the rate that people pay.
Brian, this debt service you're saying is general obligation debt service, so that's excluding any of the TID functions.
This is only what you levy for. So the gross amount of general obligation debt service is higher than what you're seeing here, but you have other revenues that are supplementing and paying for their allocable share of the total amount.
Okay.
Brian, most of the times this will be for equipment, certain street projects that don't include sewer, water, or outside of a TID.
Even if you do have utility reconstructs in a street, those are then segmented and allocated to the enterprise funds, being the
Right.
utilities, and then there is a portion that is only the streets, the sidewalks, things that are in the right of way, that sort of thing. That's what falls to the levy, the general fund.
Correct, and you have it in here later what our projects are, or what we have borrowed for in the past. You'll see it's not anything to do with TID or the water, so.
Correct. You're not presently levying for any TIF district insufficiencies. There are other ways to manage that, and so just understand that these are the general fund portions of your borrowing that you are levying taxes to repay debt.
So TID funding is separate
Above
our, what was it, 32,744,000?
In total debt?
Right.
It's a part of that. We'll walk through each
It is-
respective TIF
okay.
district, and they all have their allocable share of particular issues. So you might look at a prior debt issue, and you'll see a repayment schedule associated with that, but there's really an underlying structure where there's like tax levy, perhaps water, sewer are contributing, perhaps a TIF district or two, and so kind of behind the scenes, we break that all into its constituent pieces, and it all rolls up to a single repayment structure. Because the people that own that debt, they don't particularly care that you've got all these allocations underlying it. They just want to get paid
So
their principal
TIDs aren't
interest.
separate. It's included in our total borrowing capacity.
There are some debt issues that are secured by the revenues of the TIF districts, and they are not part of your general obligation debt. I'll point those out as we go along
Okay.
so that it's obvious. All right. The first set of these 2 pages here with respect to the 2024 financing needs speak specifically to the 2023 capital projects. And again, I want to just point out that these numbers have largely been spent already. And so cash has carried the cost, and now you're looking to reimburse. All right. And so it's broken out by project and dollar amount. The revised amount column, the bolded column, is essentially the final numbers we're working with for this exercise. And so when you build it into a summary level of detail, the general fund itself is responsible for $328,500 of capital costs. TIDs 8, 10, and 11 have $1.32 million of total project costs. And then you can see the TIDs essentially broken out there to the left of the totals. Questions? All right. Same construct on the next page, except we're just dealing with current fiscal year projects. Again, these were part of your capital plan that was adopted along with the budget in 2023 for 2024. Similar framework. We've isolated the general fund projects. Again, you can see that's equipment, streets, et cetera, to the tune of just over $1.25 million. The TIDs have $1.15 million. You can see that that's comprised entirely of TID 9. What's not specifically shown here is a project that I think is slated for the fall. I'll let staff weigh in on some of those specific details, and that's TID 7, the Spruce Street project, to the tune of $600,000. So that one, from a timing standpoint, may be outside of the framework of this discussion, but I think it's just a good one for you to be aware of, because we will look at all of the TIF districts, and you should be cognizant of projects that are kind of hanging out there and may be allocated to individual districts. All right, let's talk about the 2022 note anticipation note. Don't care so much about the naming convention. That's a statutory reference. Obviously, when you borrow, you have to point to a certain authority under law to be able to get there, essentially. And that's just one way to authorize debt. It was really done as an interim financing, hence the term anticipation. It's in anticipation of a subsequent permanent financing. When you issue this sort of debt, it's typically done in interest-only mode, so you're only paying the interest that comes due, and then there'll be a balloon structure where all of the principal comes due in a particular year. In this case, the maturity date is November 1 of this year, and so we understood that either last year or this year we would enter into some permanent financing because we didn't proceed with capital financing in 2023, and we're then going to reimburse from an issue in 2024. We left this alone because there are efficiencies to basically gather up a bigger size issue to a large degree. So we'll combine everything other than a few bits and pieces of this that will be paid in cash. All right. So at least one of the districts essentially has enough cash to just retire its allocable share, and so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to borrow for that and then just pay it off in like 1 or 2 years. All right, so we'll just go through here in some quick detail. That's all right, no worries. The general fund, the total amount of the 2022 note was $3,004,000. And if you allocate it out in dollar terms, the general fund is responsible for $975,000 of that. TID 4, $125,000. TID 7, $800,000. TID 8, $875,000. TID 11 is $200,000. And there's some small amount that's unspent, $80,000 that would have been attributable to the general fund. So we'll just have to figure out if that project is going to progress and those dollars will be spent. Then we will have to refinance that aspect as well. All right, but at the time being, that money remains unspent. And so, as I'd mentioned, the plan would be to incorporate permanently financing these dollar amounts in tandem and conjunction with the long-term capital financing for the projects we just discussed in 2024. All right, and I'll go through in greater detail here in a moment, so I'm just prefacing what we'll talk about here. Now is the time to walk through the respective tax increment districts, and certainly encourage questions if we need to get into any very granular detail or mechanics of TIF. I'm more than happy to do that. We also have plenty of material that I would call 101 and 201 level tax increment financing, and if any of you wanted to pore over that or otherwise discuss it, I'm happy to spend time in that regard at your leisure. So you just let me know and we can walk through those things, or I can provide you some of the tutorials that we have prepared, including actually video that you could look at that kind of walk you through the basic nuts and bolts of tax increment financing. All right,
Brian, one question for you.
Sure.
You know, you go back to our debt service of just under 1.8 million. That's what the portion of the levy is right now.
Yes.
If you look at our 2023 financing, on the general side, it's $328,500. You look at 24 and we're 1.25, and you look back to 2022 and we're at 975 on the general side. Is it too simplistic to say we're paying 1.8 back in and we're borrowing less on the general side every year? That's kind of our goal, to bring that number down. Is that too simplistic to say we're paying in more than we're borrowing on the general side?
You're retiring about $1.75 million 2024 through 2026, and so there have been years where you've paid down more than you've borrowed. There have also been years where you've borrowed more than you've paid down. I think the pace of borrowing has slowed a bit the last few years for any number of reasons. One of which was, we really needed the TIF districts to continue to develop in value and revenue to pay for their associated projects, and also to bring some money back to the general fund. And so the 22 was an interim step. 23, as you stated, was a little less in terms of capital amount. And then I'm assuming there were just needs that needed to be addressed in 2024. All right, I'm going to talk through tax increment district number 3. All of these forecasts are laid out similarly, and I recognize TID 3 and TID 4 have the smallest print. They're the oldest districts you have, and so therefore a lot of things have transpired, and we really try to capture it succinctly, but sometimes that can be difficult. But I'll walk you through here slowly and pay most attention to the prominent aspects of these cash flows. And so on the left side, you have years. We are in revenue year 2024. The last set of audited financials are 2022. We don't have 2023 yet. And so over the course of any given year, we work with the finance staff to essentially true everything up. We get caught up with the most recent fiscal period. We're just at a moment in time in the calendar year where typically audits aren't done. Sometimes we're at draft. I don't think we're that far off, but when the audited results are available, we refresh, we update. When new tax rates are available, we refresh, we update. When the new values are available in August, we refresh and update. So I'd say about 3 or 4 times a year, collectively, we're monitoring these cash flows and these forecasts to make sure that we can react to any negative outcomes, that our assumptions get validated, or to just refresh the forecast so that they have the best information available at that time. And so we're in revenue year 24, and why there's multiple sets of years is if you build something, it typically gets valued the next year for the tax rolls, and then you collect tax revenue the following year. So whenever it gets built in 24, typically it gets valued, full value 25, and then on the rolls, and then you collect tax revenue in 2026. So there's always a lag. It can be a year, up to 2 years in most occasions. This district is short-lived. It was created in 2005. The final year of revenue collection available is 2026. All right, so this was a 20-year district. It's unextended. There are some authorities under law to extend tax increment districts, which we'll talk about here over the course of a number of these TIDs and some potential recommendations. The capture value has increased pretty materially over the last few years. And right now, the value in this tax increment district, the taxable value, so the value that's been created since inception, so whatever was there when the district was created continues to get taxed by all the taxing jurisdictions. Everybody gets their share of the tax levy. In the case of all of the dollars of value that have materialized since the creation of this district, that's the captured tax value increment. So that's what's more than what was there at the time of creation. That number right now is $52,307,400. The city collects 100% of the taxes on that 52 million and change. But that tax revenue, that tax increment revenue, can only be spent on projects generally in this area. And so the city has used tax increment revenue to make infrastructure improvements largely in and throughout this area, as well as entered into development agreements and provides some level of public assistance on a number of projects. This district has also been amended over time to share excess increment with other TIDs that could use some additional support. And as of right now, it is authorized to share with TIDs 6, 7, and 8. TID 3 is really only ever shared with TID 8, and that is still the plan, to just focus on TID 8. We'll see the reason why here in a few slides. So this district has been quite successful. It has not only cash flowed and paid for its own projects, but it has the wherewithal to share substantial amounts, specifically with TID number 8. All right, and so over time, we look at this, as I stated frequently, and we try to map out a forecast for the transfers to TID 8 and show that as revenue for TID 8 as we're contemplating additional projects in tax increment district number 8, et cetera. The way this is set up is that TID 3 satisfies all of its obligations. You had mentioned TIF debt. and this is a good example. The 2016 bonds, GO bonds, you can see here prominently. Some of that debt service is allocated to TID 3. And yes, that counts against your borrowing capacity. But there's a priority debt issue that is a 2020 issue of tax increment revenue bonds. There is no pledge of the city's unlimited taxing authority associated with those bonds. The pledge is one that the first thing you do is with this tax increment revenue is you pay debt service on that particular series of bonds. So essentially it has a first lien or first claim on the revenues of tax increment district number 3. And if the city doesn't appropriate the dollars to make the payments, ostensibly they're in a lockbox. They can't be used for anything else. But if you do appropriate and you make the payment, you can use the remaining tax increment revenue for anything you'd like that's eligible in terms of this particular tax increment district. Now, this district can no longer spend new money on projects that ended in 2020. So essentially it's been in runoff mode ever since. So we continue to satisfy the existing obligations. The debt service that needs to be paid continues to be paid. The transfers to TID 8 can continue. And if you have development agreements that are already inked and the city has an obligation to make a payment to a developer, you can continue to do that. You just can't take on new projects, all right? And so we really have a short period of time. This district will be likely terminated after April 15th of next year. That way you'll get another year of tax increment revenue in 2026, which generally you need and you want because you want to support TID 8. And so we'll continue to make the payments on the 2020 bond. I personally think there'll be enough to make a prepayment on the 2016 general obligation bonds. And so the principal that remains after 2024 is $100,000. And so I have built in here an expense associated with prepaying TID 3's portion of that particular issue. All right, so that'll retire some debt.
Quick question.
Yes.
With the tax incremental profits, by subsidizing TID 8 with the profits from 3, now the profits are shared with there's 3 or 4 entities, not just the city, right, correct? I mean, it's the profits are split between what, the school district, the city,
County and this.
county, and I
Tech
forget what
College.
they were.
Technical college, yeah.
Now, if we're giving money to TID 8 from 3, does that just come out of the city's profit portion? I mean, do the other 3 entities get their money up front and the city's only obligating to pay this to TID 8?
So, as I stated at the front end, so this district collected, in 2023, this district collected $991,440 in tax increment.
Okay.
The city took all of that money in.
Okay.
That is 100% of the tax revenue. It is not split by jurisdiction. When the district is created, there is a group organized. It's called the Joint Review Board. And so that is comprised of all the taxing jurisdictions, the city, the county, the Tech College, and the school district. There's also a public member, is typically a citizen from the local jurisdiction. At the time of creation, the city prepares a plan. It goes before that group, and it essentially asks for permission to do exactly what I just described, to create the district, understanding, and all of the jurisdictions understand that the city will collect 100% of the tax revenue on every dollar of value over and above what's already in that geographic area that's defined by a boundary. They do that because they know that you are the pointy tip of the spear with respect to economic development and redevelopment. And so the school is not engaging in that activity, but you are, ultimately for their benefit, because when you close the district, you should be returning to the tax rolls more taxable value than would have otherwise been there without the use of this tool. There's no way to know, even in hindsight, whether or not that would have been the case, but even when you go to do the sharing arrangement, you have to amend the district to do that. And in order to do that, you have to once again organize the Joint Review Board and go before them and state that your intention is to share increment from TID 3, in this case with TID 6, 7, and 8, and they have to approve that. So they are agreeing to allow the city to do that at that time.
Okay.
As far as the excess increment goes, when you terminate a district and there are dollars still there, net of recovering all the costs. You pay all your debt. If there are other funds that have paid cash for things and there's a a payable back to that fund. So let's say the general fund paid for something, that's a TIF eligible expense. It really provided the financing in the form of a loan, essentially, an internal loan. And then the TIF district has to pay that back. You satisfy all your obligations, you've recovered all your project costs, and then there's an excess balance. That balance gets split amongst all 4 taxing jurisdictions, including the city. So that's what happens with the excess revenue at the point of termination. But during the life of the district, the city retains 100% of the tax increment revenue, but it's really held in kind of a special trust fund that can only be spent on projects to improve this area.
Thank you.
All right, so if we move forward in time, ostensibly this district will terminate by resolution in 2025. You will collect 1 more year of tax increment in 2026, and when you do your budget for 2027, the value that's captured here will be returned to the tax rolls in 26 for your 27 budget, right? So you'll levy generally applicable property taxes against this value when you set your levy in 2026 and then collect that tax revenue in 2027. Which is meaningful because that's probably about 8% of your total tax base right now. We'll come back to the general tax rolls. All right, moving on to TID 4. Again, there's a lot going on with TID 4, again, because it's, 17 years in age at the present time. Also a mixed-use district, gives it a 20-year life. The unextended life right now has the city collecting tax increment through 2031. I think generally speaking, this has also been a successful district. There is a small cash balance, and that's why we have that box in the upper right-hand corner. It's just where are you at right now? Obviously, we move forward in time, but that's the last audit period. And at the end of fiscal 22, there was, a little less than $80,000 in cash on the balance sheet of TID number 4. So again, let's go through some of the details. 9.9 million in captured taxable value. That produces right around $215,000 in tax increment revenue for this fiscal year. There are a number of debt issues outstanding that this district is responsible for paying. We have, again, a tax increment revenue bond that has a first lien on the TIF revenues, and again, does not count against the borrowing capacity of the city. It is still the city's debt, but it is not general obligation debt. And we've purposely done that where we have districts that have strong cash flow positions that can essentially make that sort of a pledge, primarily for the reason because it doesn't eat up your borrowing capacity and leaves that available for other things. All right, and we'll talk about that a little more here as we get towards the end. There are also a number of general obligation issues outstanding, a 2017 issue of bonds, and the city borrowed from the State Trust Fund Loan Program, which is a general obligation of the city in 2022. That is a 10-year loan. There's a payment that's outside of the life of the TIF district, and so that's where you see that prepay amount. If we don't extend this district, you're going to want to make that payment and retire that portion, and so we want to make sure it's accounted for. There is an allocable share of the 2022 note anticipation note. We talked about that. In the case of TID 4, I would argue you just want to take available resources and pay that part off. And so that's why, in this case, I have built in both the amount of the principal, the balloon portion, as well as the interest that would be due through November 1 of 24. You don't have to wait until November 1 of 24 to do what I described. And so that could essentially happen, I'd say, after the second tax collection, which will be in July, August. You should have all of the revenue for the year at that point for this district. And so we can get into the fine detail with staff as we talk about the more intricate finance plan. This district is eligible to share with TID 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, although we've really never leveraged it for anything other than sharing with TID 9. And so between TIDs 3 and 4, the cash flows, the transfers are really set up to exhaust all of the available revenues. So whatever is available that isn't necessary to pay those districts' expenses is being transferred to the other districts to allow them to pay for their expenditures as well as the new ones that we'll be talking about to provide additional support. TID 9, you'll see, requires the highest level of support. And so we'll talk about some options that can bring some additional resources to bear. In the case of TID 4, I apologize, I should have mentioned, we're showing this with a 3-year extension. This district was created in 2007 and is therefore eligible for a 3-year extension. Are you required to do that? No. In this case, we're assuming that you do, primarily because TID 9 needs material support to continue to satisfy its own obligations, and there are additional capital costs that we're going to talk about in the context of this finance plan. And so if you look at the last 3 years in the sharing with TID 9 column, it's 2, 3, 4, there's over $500,000 in resources brought to bear to TID 9, which are meaningful and certainly valuable to that TIF district's ultimate success. And so we can make ourselves, we can avail ourselves of the 3-year extension under law. I can get into the details if you'd like. That's probably for another day, but this does assume that is the case. Without the 3-year extension, this district will still recover all of its costs. It's primarily an opportunity to get another $500,000 or so of resources for TID 9, which we'll see requires support. All right, TID 5, unless there are other questions on TID 4. All right, TID 5, rather straightforward. This district is in fine shape, and I guess I'll be brief and say that no matter what, even if you terminate this district tomorrow, it will still collect tax increment revenue in 2025. That collection in 2025 should be sufficient to essentially collect enough revenue to pay all the obligations. And so I would argue you could make a prepayment on those 2013 bonds, and this district can be terminated and go back to the tax rolls. And I think you can do that basically anytime prior to April 15th of next year. So there's no rush, and in fact, I would argue you want to get the 2023 audited financials so that this can be verified, right? We've got a forecast in here. I recognize it's really only one period that we're moving forward in time, but there's no reason to not let time unfold. Get the final numbers for 23, plug them in to validate that you're in a fine place to just collect next year's tax increment revenue, and you can terminate this district anytime leading up to April 15th of next year.
What is the 5,000 administrative?
There are costs associated with having any open tax increment district. The city needs to pay the state a certification fee every year. The auditors do work associated with all of the tax increment districts and charge out of their total fee. Part of it is related to the work they do on the TIF district, so that can be allocated. There are sometimes staff time associated with administering TIF districts, so the cost of people can be allocated to TIF districts. There are other professional costs that one might incur throughout the course of the year, so you can only know what they are after the fact, but I'd rather personally have a placeholder in there to account for some cash outflow so that we're not overspending, so to speak.
So each TID has 5,000 assigned to it?
It could be 7,500, it could be 2,500. You know, some of the newer ones don't require a lot of effort. There's really no value in them, and they're not producing a lot of revenue, and they haven't really incurred any costs. So other than the fact that you got to pay the state to certify the value and collect increment, the costs on those ones are probably pretty nominal. Some of these older districts that require kind of more technical assistance are probably maybe a little higher than 5,000. But I'd rather, my personal feeling, let's account for some expense, but we'll true it up every year when we see the balances at the end of each fiscal period.
Are these internal auditors you're talking about?
Nope, external.
Oh, external. Good.
So when you see the financial statements for 2023, you'll see a lot of references to the various tax increment districts, and then there'll be a section at the back that'll have supplemental information that'll kind of set out balance sheets and revenues and expenses for each of the TIDs. And so again, part of their effort is putting into place the procedures to do the audit around the TIDs, and then they also help produce a report that is required to be filed with Department of Revenue every year prior to July 1. All right, TID 6. TID 6, let's start with the box in the top right. And so I would argue this is like the starting place, basically the last audited fiscal period of 2022. TID 6 owes the general fund $512,750. And so when I spoke about different ways of financing tax increment district projects, you could do that out of the available cash balance in a TIF district, right? So TIDs 3 and 4 both have cash. Now, they can't spend more money because they're outside of their expenditure period, but if they could, you could use the cash balances to pay for things, capital projects, you name it. If they don't have enough cash or current resources, you could go borrow externally. We could go to the bond market, we could get bank financing, whatever the case may be. We can go get money and then use the tax increment revenues to pay the debt service. Another way to do things is to use cash from another fund and establish essentially an internal loan, a kind of a bank on yourself approach. And you've done that in a number of districts. And so you've used cash from another fund, primarily the general fund, to pay for tax increment eligible projects in specific districts, and then you use the tax increment revenue to repay the general fund over time. All right, so all of those approaches can be brought to bear over the course of time. You've done pretty much all of those over the course of history and with respect to utilization of tax increment districts.
So we do use, on occasion, general funds to support the TID.
With the intent of using the TID revenues to pay back the general fund. So the general fund has cash, and essentially you loan it from one fund
I get it.
to another. Got it. All right.
Where exactly is this TID district? TID 6?
Downtown.
This is downtown? Okay.
All right, let's walk through TID 6. Again, a number of these districts are set up as eligible recipients of shared increments, but that's never been brought to bear for a few of these. TID 6 is one of them. So TIDs 3 and 4 are not sharing any revenue with TID 6. The captured value, $7.87 million, about $173,000 in revenue. And there are a series of debt obligations outstanding, all of which are general obligations, all right, that TID 6 is responsible for making payments. If we're going to make a prepayment from the TIF districts on the 2013 bonds, there's a logical argument to be made that we also do so with respect to TID 6. And so that's where you're seeing that number in there. And that can be paid largely out of current cash flow of this district. As you go from left to right, you can see our annual balance remains positive over the remaining life of the district. And so that annual balance is really being used then to pay back the general fund. So you can see we've got our $512,750 advance is reduced in 23 through allocation of the annual balance right back to the general fund again in 24 and again in 25 until we get to a positive number in the cumulative balance column. And so the city gets to make decisions with respect to the excess on an annual basis. You're not required under any law to take what is there and immediately repay the general fund all or some. You get to make those decisions on an annual basis. But generally speaking, this has been a priority item for the council for a number of years, and certainly makes sense in terms of recovering what has been outlaid from the general fund, right? You've got a receivable on the balance sheet of the general fund. You want to turn the receivable into cash. Right, so the liability on the part of the TIF district is reduced by transferring its cash, available cash, to the general fund to retire that outstanding advance. All right, so looking forward, there's about a 4 to 5 year recovery period with respect to the $500,000. Let's call it 5, looks like here. If you move forward in time, to me, as you're glancing at these numbers, the bottom of the cumulative balance column tells you at the end of the life of the district, if the revenue stayed the same and you took on no new projects, where would the district land? And you'd be in the black, $1.5 million. Now, this district is still in its expenditure period. You can continue to take on new projects through 2031. All right, so out of the districts that we've looked at, this is really the first one that we've looked at that's still within that viable expenditure period timeline and will potentially have resources to take on new projects, although we're not really discussing any at this present time. Any questions?
How did we come up with a $106,000 payment from a 2013 bond prepay?
That's the remaining principal, the shaded box. That's all the principal that comes due over those years.
Okay.
If you see that similar construct, it's the same concept for all of those where there's like a prepay and a boxed portion. That's all the principal. So then we also forego the interest that's due during that period as well.
Okay, so, okay.
So it's a money saver, essentially.
That's good.
All right. TID 7. This district is a 27-year district. Again, I'm happy to get into gory detail, but could probably leave it at that for the time being. And in all occasions, you do have the wherewithal to terminate districts early if you'd like. You're not required to leave them open their entire lives. But there are occasions where they do stay open that long. It's not uncommon either. So you see it really both ways. The captured value for TID 7, just under $9.5 million. That produces this year about $209,000 of revenue. And then again, you can see we've got various debt issues. And when you look at the 2022 note, all we're showing here is the interest. All right, so the district will pay the interest. We could potentially apply some cash, but I personally like it when there's some cash left on the balance sheet. There's an advance outstanding and there is cash. Like I said, you don't have to zero out the advance just because you have available cash resources, all right? So you can have both things at the same time. In this case, we do have, I should just leave that page out so I can make my own reference to it. Sorry, I want to look at the 2022 note. TID 7 has $800,000 remaining. So clearly there's not just $800,000 in cash sitting on the balance sheet of TID 7. So we will need to extend that. And so the way I think about that is we know we've got $800,000 that needs to be amortized over the remaining life of the district. If we run this district out to the end without accounting for that, we've got about 2.7 million of excess. Clearly we can handle the 800,000. There will be interest on it, but that's still a wide enough margin to be comfortable that this district can pay for everything that's presently incurred. All right, and then we had also talked about the potential for the roughly $600,000 Spruce Street project. Again, I would argue you're in a position where this district can cash flow both its existing obligations and take on additional obligations. Questions on TID 7? And before I move on, I'm sorry. Some of these districts that are looking like they're strong cash flow positive, I recognize we haven't baked everything into this district. That's really for the next conversation we have, is to craft the finance plan and show you the impacts. Probably too much to all do at one single discussion. So TIDs 9 and 10 are eligible recipients of shared increments. There's certain designations that are required under law to make a district eligible. You also have to go through that amendment process that I discussed on the front end. So you can't just like flip a switch and decide you're going to do that. You must get the consent of the other taxing jurisdictions. And so because some of these districts are both eligible and not as successful, and you have additional capital costs, you could argue that they need some more support. You don't ever have to transfer a dollar out of a donor to a recipient, but you certainly reserve the right to do so. And so I would call it cheap insurance to make sure that if a district isn't producing enough revenue to satisfy its annual cost, that you're not having to go to the well and draw cash from another fund and then essentially advance it to that district. You can also levy taxes to pick up the debt service if it's general obligation debt and there's insufficient revenue. So in order to avoid both of those situations, the donor status is like a safety valve. Or if you know you have to take on new projects, but there's just not going to be enough revenue there, now you've got a source of funding that you get to make a choice. Again, once you set that up, it's not on autopilot. You can choose every single year whether or not you transfer money, take on new projects with the intent of transferring money. All those things come back to the council. So, but as we'll look here, TID 9 needs additional support. There's also additional capital costs that needs to be brought to bear. And so a number of these districts, it does make some logical sense to potentially put the same sort of construct in place that TID 3 and 4 presently have And a lot of that has to do with those are great resources, but they have finite lives. Some of these other districts run longer in time, and so can additionally provide some meaningful resources.
Brian, are you comfortable if we got about 5 minutes before our council meeting?
I can go faster. Trust me. Yeah.
I mean, are you going to be able to finish up and?
Once we get past TID 10, there's really nothing. I guess TID 11 has some capital costs. I can go faster.
Okay,
Happy to.
we're in a 6:30, we gotta start the council.
That's right.
meeting, so.
It is a lot to digest. So TID 8, we'll go quickly. It's just under $12 million in value. We are taking in some transfer to revenue. You can see we have a number of debt obligations that are outstanding. We also have about 1.275 of additional financing that we need. Again, I'll point to that 2022 NAN. We're showing only the interest. And so we need to refinance $875,000, extend it into permanent. We've got $400,000 of capital projects. There is a general fund advance, just under $600,000. And so the objective here is to be able to take on those costs and also transfer in money from TID 3 so that we can pay back the general fund. All right, so again, we set this up because it's all the same construct, so I hope it becomes a little more obvious as we're talking about a handful of these. Clearly, this district can take on some additional costs, but we just want to be cautious and make sure we're moving forward with things that beyond this current set of capital expenditures that make logical sense in terms of the cash flow requirements. TID 9, again, is in okay shape, but if we put in the $1,150,000 of new costs, let's again revisit that number bottom right corner. Obvious that we're exceeding that number, right? And so that's why I'm pointing to some of these other districts that have available resources that they can transfer money in to help support the costs of tax increment district number 9. It also serves the objective of repaying the general fund and not having to make choices each and every year as to where that money goes. Do we repay the general fund? Do we pay for new costs? There'll be enough resources to not have to engage in those sorts of discussions. Also available for a 3-year extension. And again, that's like a safety valve. It's really cheap insurance to be able to get that additional 3 years. You don't have to use it. You can always terminate early, but at least it's there in the event it's needed. TID 10, we're looking at about $750,000 of new money. There is a 2021 bond anticipation note, very much like a note anticipation note, just a different section of law. That has I think $550,000 of principal. I'm sorry, $565 of principal outstanding. That comes due in 26. So we have the benefit of time. We don't need to deal with that right at this moment. It's at 2.75%, which is better than where you could get money today. So I'd argue we let that hang out there for a bit and focus on the new money needs. If there's an opportunity to tie that in based on available cash flow and extend that balloon, we can do that now. So part of the next discussion is reviewing some options and alternative scenarios. TID 10 is in okay shape. You can see we can take on additional capital costs, but we need to account for additional interest on the balloon, and then we also have the $750,000 of new money and repay the general fund. Questions? All right, the transfers would be beneficial to both TIDs 9 and 10 from these other potential donor districts. TID 11, actually in very good shape, and if we just kind of run down the bulleted list, we've got $200,000 that needs to be extended. This district doesn't have enough cash to immediately do that and just pay it off. There's $180,000 in new money to the tune of $380,000 of financing needed. There should be a priority on repaying the general fund, and when we look at some debt options, I think we'll argue this new set of financing can be amortized a little more rapidly because there's strong cash flow. And then again, this is a good candidate to be a donor to TIDs 9 and 10. I'm going to let all of you run through TIDs 12 and 13. Those are the most recent districts, and 14 as well. There's really just not a lot going on in any of them of note, and they're all in fine shape and don't really present any risk to the city. And so what we've done on slide 19 is really just summarize what I would call likely TID action, so foreshadowing a bit in terms of additional items that might come before you over the course of the calendar year. There's no deadlines on these in terms of taking action by a certain date, and so I'd argue we kind of let the financing process unfold. If we can go concurrently with some TID amendments, then great, but we'll have staff weigh in on that. Let's look at pages 20 and 21, and then I will be done. Unless there are questions. And so what we've done here is really break everything into its constituent pieces so that you can clearly identify at a summary level the dollar amounts associated with the various repayment sources. The general fund requires just under $2.65 million of financing both capital projects and putting the note anticipation note into permanent mode. TID 7, if the $600,000 Spruce Street project is a go, needs $1.4 million. We should explore a TID revenue bond because it won't take up the city's borrowing capacity, and there is reasonable cash flow in that district that we can show we can meet the payments. TID 8, similar situation with the NAN extension and capital financing. Again, I could argue a TID revenue bond makes sense there. TID 9 doesn't have the cash flow to support a TID revenue bond structure. So that would be either interim financing. Again, we don't want to put you in the hole right away. So if you come out of the gates with amortizing debt, principal and interest payments, knowing full well there's not enough revenue to support them, the money comes from somewhere, and ostensibly it comes from the general fund. So I don't know that that makes a lot of sense. So in my mind, we might look at a couple different options for you there and talk through that at our next session. TID 10 has strong cash flow as well. TID revenue bond might make some sense. These are all things that can be discussed behind the scenes before the next time we talk, so I can give you feasibility on those paths. And then TID 11, the dollar amounts are relatively small, and that can be repaid very rapidly. So a general obligation financing for the TID 11 projects to me makes sense. And then as far as calendar goes, we're really looking at about a roughly 60 to 90 day schedule from today, and that would include closing. And so we're having a high level of discussion today and potential actions on the TIDs. I would anticipate at the June meeting that we would come back to you with a series of recommendations on a finance plan. We can also have authorizing resolutions prepared with the assistance of bond counsel at Quarles and Brady. We can communicate all the salient details. Those authorizing resolutions really just set the stage for what would then be an award resolution at a subsequent meeting. So you're not locked into anything at that point, but you've essentially signaled your intent to issue the debt and then authorize the various professional parties around you to work with your staff to complete all the documents, et cetera, et cetera. You would then see some more granular detail. Here are the issues we're proposing. Here's the size and structure. Here's the impacts to the various repayment sources, the tax levy, the TIDs. And then in July would be about as soon as you could act on an award resolution, which would essentially lock you in. All rates and terms would be made final. The repayment structures would be established. And then closing would occur roughly 3 weeks later. That timeline can be extended, of course. Our hard and fast deadline, November 1, 24, is when that note anticipation note matures. So we need the money in hand to be able to retire that note prior to or on its maturity date. All right? Thank you for that. That was a lot. So I'm happy to answer any other questions. Otherwise, I'm certainly fine moving on.
Emily, you have anything to add? Or
Nope, I don't have anything to add. Thank you for that, Brian.
I guess the only thing I would add is we're operating on cash right now off of last year. We need to pay that back to make sure we have operating cash. So we can't let it go until November 1st. We should do it as soon as possible.
All fair. There have been moments where it's gotten a little tight towards the end of the calendar year, and I mean, you got to, payroll and whatnot, and so you're in a good cash position now. But yes, time is of the essence.
so next month we'll have a plan in place and present it here or a committee of the whole or something.
We'll bring a recommendation, and you'll be able to opine on it and bring it on to council.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
I have a motion and a second to adjourn. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you. We'll take a 5-minute break for